Hey there, it is Mr. K. Welcome back. Today we are going to, sorry if you can see that there. We're still on the um, objective of explaining the function of a particular sequence of events in a plot. Today, what we're going to do is, or in this lesson, help you identify the plot structure of a short piece of fiction and help you discuss the function of that structure. So the last lecture was all about different structures of plot, right? And today is using those to really look at an example and just show you an example of like how one could go about talking about plot structure in the first place, right? And so that's the idea. So the goals today, we want to describe a plot's sequence and explain the function of a plot's sequence. The hard thing with plot is that oftentimes we assume that plot is like the events, what happens, and just saying like, well, the plot is like just like the story, and that's partly true. That's like grounded in truth, but there's just more to it, and especially when we're trying to analyze literature like a bunch of awesome people like we are, we want to go a little deeper than that. All right. A quick disclaimer, I've given this before, but for today's lecture to make sense, you have to read The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. If you need to, pause real quick. It's readily available on Google, and it's super short. You can read it in a couple minutes. Read and analyze it. It might take a couple minutes more, but it's fantastic. So you need to, like, I'm using that as my example today. So if you haven't read the story, you'll be like, what is going on? All right. So hit pause if you need to and go find that story. All right. So last time we talked about, the standard or traditional plot structure where you have exposition, things are happening, then there's rising action, a climax, falling action, resolution, right? And we talked about how this assumes that story has a linear structure. If it has a linear structure, then sure, it typically would follow that kind of shape there. But we also talked about stories that are nonlinear, in media res, flashback, frame narrative, epistolary, and all of those different types, right? And so today I want to actually apply these ideas to a short story, story of an hour, right? So the plot structure in The Story of an Hour, right? It is linear, meaning the chronological narrative of the events that take place within an hour, right? That is how the narrative unfolds from start to finish. And being able to recognize that is awesome, but that's like the first step, right? If you read Story of an Hour and you recognize, okay, this is a linear structure, this is a linear plot, that's great. But then what if your teacher or your professor asks you, okay, now why is that important? That's a hard question. That truly is a hard question, and one that, took me to get into college before I was like able to really think through that. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. That's just like what happens, like that, like things just happen that way. Like, plot point 1, then 2, then 3. I don't know. Like that's just how the author did it. Instead of being able to kind of verbalize why that's actually significant. So that's what we're gonna try today. All right. So The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin is linear. It's a chronological narrative. All right. So as we see, taking a couple plot points, moving from left to right, Richards ensures that Mr. Mallard is dead. Then Mrs. Mallard is told. She cries and goes to her room alone. Then she notices the spring life outside her window. Then she realizes that she can now live for herself. She whispers that she is free, body and soul free. She learns that her husband lives, and then she dies, right? So you see, happens right in order. The story of an hour. The events in this story take place within an hour of each other. right? So even in the title, we see the reference to its chronological structure, right? Now, so what, right? Who cares? Well, if we're going to analyze literature in a deeper way, we should care. We should care very much about being able to describe why that's important. Okay, so I want to show you an example. Now, this is something that I wrote using kind of ideas from CollegeBoard. All right, being able to go from this to boom, this, like, calm down, it's okay. um, I put more detail than maybe is needed, but I'm really trying to lay on the point for you to see how we move from recognizing that a story is told chronologically to answering the question of why that matters, right? So here's what I came up with. In Chopin's The Story of an Hour, we are privy to the sudden progression, the awakening of Mrs. Mallard. We learn of Mr. Mallard's death at the same time Mrs. Mallard, and I should say, I'm sorry, at the same time Mrs. Mallard does. This forward progression of the plot allows us to watch in real time as Mrs. Mallard changes from a trapped housewife to a blooming individual. It's because of this very progression that makes the ending of the story so tragic. Though we're told that Mrs. Mallard dies of a, quote, joy that kills, we know that that simply isn't true. She did not fit into the strict gender roles of the 19th century. Instead, she died at the end of the story because she knew that with her husband's miraculous return, she would return to her caged existence in her home. Instead of experiencing the new life of spring, she would only watch it happen from the confines of her room. Only Mrs. Mallard and we, the readers, understand that it is this disappointment that kills her in the end, and we're left to think about this tragedy. Okay, I had a typo there. Pretty good, right? I want to actually go back a slide, 2 slides, if that's okay, right? So those were my thoughts, initial thoughts on why a structure like this matters, right? So Mrs. Mallard changes from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. We see her change very suddenly, like with the news of her husband's death. Bam, she is inconsolable, sinks into her chair. She has a lifeless expression. She seems to have no thought process going on. It seems like she's just kind of intellectually just kind of like flatlined, right? And so we're watching this happen in real time, and so we're thinking, oh my gosh, she met her. She talked about her husband's death. Well, she's obviously sad, right? We're learning with her, but then we see in real time as she says, she looks out the window and she sees the new spring life, and she's like, I can live for myself now. I'm free. She realizes she can now live for herself. She whispers that she is free, body and soul free. We realize, oh, she wasn't inconsolable. She was paralyzed with happiness that her husband is dead and she can now be a free woman, right? And then we learn at the end, when she learns that Mr. Mallard is actually alive and he comes home and she falls over dead, right? And the story ends by saying that she dies of joy that kills? Is that correct? Yes. Joy that kills, right? She's so happy to see her husband. No. And we know that she's not because we were there. We were there watching in real time the progression of events happen. We were able to see Mrs. Mallard's change and development as a character over time, right? And in the end, we know more than really anyone in the story. They think she died because she is so happy, right? But we, the readers, are actually given this kind of power from the writer, Kate Chopin, that we actually we know really why she died. We actually know what happened. That's a way to describe, to go that next step as far as like how are events revealed and in what order and why does that matter, right? So some questions to ask yourself for the function of plot. How does a particular sequence of events affect the presentation and or development of characters and conflict? And second, how does a particular sequence of events and the manner in which a text presents those events to a reader affect a reader's experience with the text? Right? Think about how different this story could have been if, it started with a kind of, omniscient narrator saying, something like, Mrs. Mallard died of sadness, but her death was believed to be, the result of happiness. Here's what happened, right? And then you kind of so the ending is sort of revealed to you in the beginning, and then you already know the ending, right? And then you read the story, and you're like, oh, she's not at the beginning when she hears about her husband's death. She's not inconsolable. She's happy that he dies. It doesn't have the same kind of punch the story gives you. The story, when you get to the end, you realize like, oh my gosh, this woman was finally free, and now she's died from sadness. You know what I mean? It's we go on the journey as well. We go on an emotional journey, and so thinking through why certain stories are told in certain orders, with certain structures. And so today's goals: describe a plot sequence, which we did with Story of an Hour, and explain the function of a plot sequence. I hope this was helpful as we start to get further and further into lit. Anytime you have a question, please let me know, and I'd be happy to help you. All right, thanks, guys. See ya.